I feel really privileged, and it's a pleasure to be on the Advanced Apologetics Network. So you're all advanced. So that means you're all very keen, enthusiastic, and in all likelihood have gone extremely deep on all sorts of different subjects in the room. Many of you, probably most of you, on some subjects deeper than I have or ever will. So I'm interested in learning and gleaming as much of your knowledge and experience as I possibly can while I'm here. I'll introduce myself, and then I'll introduce the talk. So my name is Simon Edwards. I work with the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. I'm married, 3 kids. They keep me grounded and sane, which is helpful because my book is called The Sanity of Belief, Why Faith Makes Sense. I'm from Australia. I am a lawyer by background. Then I came and studied at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, did some further postgrad theology at the University of Oxford, and now find myself, to my surprise, a speaker and a lecturer and a writer at the OCCA, which means I have the privilege and the pleasure of getting to talk about Jesus in universities and schools and workplaces and churches. Today I'm talking on, I think the short title is Make Them Wish It Were True. And as you're all advanced apologists, you will know that that's a quote from Pascal. You often hear the phrase, make them wish it were true in terms of our Christian faith, and then show them that it is. And I think that the reason that I probably got asked to do this talk is because that's what I at least tried to do in this book, The Sanity of Belief, in the first half, trying to reach people who don't go to church by trying to make them wish Christianity were true, by helping them to see that Christian faith makes sense of the things that really matter to us as human beings. Things like meaning and value and goodness and truth and hope and love, and how Jesus Christ answers our deepest questions and fulfills this deepest needs. And then in the second half of the book, I try to show them that it is true. But here's where I'm nervous. All right, and here's the disclaimer, which of course you would expect from a lawyer. Get a disclaimer, which is, how shall I put it? There's a difference between doing and teaching. Has anyone here ever learnt to drive from their parents? Yes. Okay, did you, like me, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder after this experience? Was this very, very challenging for you? Yeah, well, so I assumed that because my dad could drive a car, that would mean that my dad could teach me how to drive a car. I quickly realized that doing and teaching how to do is not the same thing. And so I'm more of a practitioner, I'm more of an evangelist than a theoretician. But in this talk, I've got to be a theoretician. I'm not going to try to make you wish Christianity were true, but I'm going to talk about, all right, how do we make people wish Christianity were true? What's the framework of our thinking in order to do that? And why should we even make people wish it were true? And so, confession, completely new material on my part. I'm road testing it on all of you. So I just want to say before I start, thank you for willingly volunteering to be my guinea pigs. And thank you for willingly volunteering to help me see how this material can be improved as you comment, ask questions, share insights. So with that disclaimer being said, let me just share what I think are some grounding assumptions, which at least I hold, and I think we might all, if not, let's talk about it. But I just take it as a given that Christian apologetics is all about giving people reasons for why we believe, what we believe as Christians, that in defending Christian faith, we should do it without being defensive, and that in answering questions about Christian faith, we should do it without being aggressive. And I take it that the point of Christian apologetics is not to win arguments, is to win people to Jesus by helping them to see that he's good and he's true and he's what we all need. Now, as you know, someone who was very good at doing this was the Apostle Paul. As we read in Acts 17, that when Paul met with the Jews who were familiar with the scriptures, that he reasoned with them and explained and proved from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. Those are the verbs used: reasoning, explaining, and proving. And we see that God uses that and that some were persuaded. And then later in Acts 17, we read that when Paul reasoned with a different group of people, Greek thinkers, in the public square in the Areopagus in Athens, that he references their poets, Epimenides and Aratus, who, though pagan philosophers, said some true things about God. In him we live and move and have our being, and we are his offspring, and that Paul also references their spiritual searching. He speaks about their altar to the unknown God, and then uses that as a platform to springboard a conversation onto the God of all heaven and all earth, who can be known because he's made himself knowable in Jesus Christ. I think we find ourselves in a very interesting and somewhat complex situation. Has anyone read Tom Holland's book Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind? A few nods. So his thesis that our morality is Christian. Like, what's he say? We're all like a goldfish swimming in the water, which is Christianity. Like our unthinking assumptions about the worth and dignity of every human being, regardless of race, ethnicity, it's Christian morality, but we don't even realize it anymore. So he says our morality is Christian. But on the other hand, my good friend Dave Benson from the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, did I pronounce that right, Dave? Yeah, very good. Okay, so Dave, as Dave likes to say, but we're also, I think this is a really good way of putting it, our culture is also post-Christian in attitude, but it's also pre-Christian in understanding. So just let's pause for a moment and digest that. Today in Europe, we find ourselves, now this is broadly speaking when I say Europe, but we find ourselves living in a cultural context that is largely Christian in its morality, post-Christian in its attitude, pre-Christian in its understanding. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when it comes to Christian faith, our culture is increasingly rejecting that which it increasingly no longer appreciates nor understands. In other words, to paraphrase a quote from my favorite thinker, G.K. Chesterton, today's skeptic is already weary of hearing what he's never heard. And so with that challenging context in mind, I think, wouldn't it be great if we were just like the picture of the Apostle Paul on your notes? I think, wouldn't it be great if all of us were just like the Apostle Paul? We were all able to stand up and engage confidently in the marketplace with all the tough questions and objections that people have today about Christian faith. But the reality for most people is that when it comes to dealing with the tough questions and challenges, we feel less like the Apostle Paul on the left and more like ordinary Paul on the right in notes. That is, we can just feel genuinely intimidated because we feel there are so many different questions and objections that people might raise today about Christian faith. We don't know, people just don't know, Christians don't know where or how to start dealing with them all. But something I've found helpful is trying to classify the questions into broad groupings. And I think that all the questions and objections people have today about faith, Christian faith, can be classified into three broad categories. Either people find it difficult to believe that Christianity could possibly be true, or difficult to believe that it could possibly be good, or difficult to believe that it could possibly help in any practical way. Which means that objections that people have about Christianity tend to fall into one of three categories. That Christianity is either irrational, there's no God, or immoral, I don't like your God, or irrelevant, I don't need your God. So for example, objections within the category of irrational, science has disproved God, come on. Or Christianity is just a psychological crutch. Or immoral, if your God's so good, why is there so much suffering? Isn't religion the number one cause of violence in the world? Or irrelevant, I don't need your God to be happy. Or I don't need religion to be good. Historically, it generally used to be assumed that Christianity was something good and something helpful in society. And so therefore, most of the objections that people had about Christianity was that it was, were intellectual objections, that it was somehow unreasonable or irrational for this or that reason, science, history, evidence, whatever. But in recent years, there's been a shift. It's no longer taken for granted that Christianity is something good, or even that it's something helpful for society. And therefore, one of the challenges facing Christian apologetics today in the 21st century is that demonstrating the truth or reasonableness of Christianity doesn't always lead people to embrace Christianity. So it's, I'll just have time of questions in a sec, sir. Yeah. So, for example, I don't know if anyone's experienced this, but it's not unusual for someone to respond to a presentation about all the good reasons and evidence we have to believe that Christianity is true. I've had this experience, and you're sort of waiting for people to go, oh, if I've seen it's true, then okay, great, I'll be a Christian. But often you just get a simple shrug of the shoulders and a reply that says, well, maybe it is true, but so what? In other words, maybe it is, but how does your claim that it's true how's that something good or something relevant to my life? How does that make any difference? And actually, they do have a point, because just because something's true doesn't mean that it's necessarily relevant to my life. It's true, for example, you might be interested to know that prawns or shrimps have their heart in their heads. Yes, it's true. I see you're all skeptical, but this is true. It's also true that Venus is the only planet that spins clockwise. It's also true that Australia is wider than the moon. But these truths, though perhaps interesting, make no practical difference to most people's lives. And so what you'll find in conversation with people about faith is that whereas the most important question for people in previous years was generally, is it true? Just like this survey suggests, a lot more people today are asking, is it good or does it work? And so we just got to bear that in mind. If I'm motivated by what is true, I won't be interested in believing something that's irrational. If I'm motivated by what is good, I won't be interested in believing in something that I feel is immoral. If I'm motivated by what works in real life, I won't commit to something that is irrelevant to real life. For me as well, totally full admission, for me, definitely the first category, is it true? That was the most important question of the three for me. I didn't grow up in a Christian family, just non-religious, but I wanted to work out what's true about life, and I wanted to align myself with what's true. And if I'd come to the conclusion that atheism was true, I would have been an atheist. Not because I would have wanted to be an atheist or found it more appealing, but because intellectual integrity would have demanded it, and I'm sure many of you relate to that. The point, though, is to realize, like the practical importance is to realize, if you're in a conversation with someone, don't assume that your primary motivating question is their primary motivating question. If you're thinking, it's all about, is it true? And they're not even interested in the question, you're probably going to be doing this in conversation. And so it's understanding that people are coming from different angles in our conversational apologetics. And it's also helping people to see it's being well-rounded. We want to be able to, as Christian apologists, not be one-dimensional. We want to help people see that Christianity is true, but also that it's something good and practically relevant. That, okay, if we're like sort of normal, like if we're eggheads and we just compute, which I'm a bit like that, we might just come across as if Christianity is nothing more than a series of external truths that need to be confirmed, but we also have to help people see that it's something internal to be experienced. And when I say it, I mean Jesus. So it helps to bear in mind all three questions, I think. Is it true? Is it good? Does it work? They're all valid and important in the sense that all three questions can be the means by which God leads people on a journey towards Jesus. Because Jesus is not only the truth, he's also the way, which is, a traditional way of saying the way to live, the good, the way, the good, what's good, and the good way to live. And he's also the life. So he's also what is good, and he's also the good life. So he is all true and all good and all life. And it's actually rather beautiful the way that Christian faith brings these concerns together, the concern for truth, as well as for goodness, as well as for life, because we tend to separate them as human beings. In the ancient world, for example, mythology sought God through the imagination and experience. Philosophy sought God through the intellect. But pagan culture could seemingly never unite these two halves of the human mind the way that Christianity could. If you've never read C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces, it's a wonderful bringing together of these things. But with the great shift in also... what's worse, I suppose, is the great shift in thinking that came after the scientific revolution, which is called the Enlightenment. Then we had this split. The realm of values, meaning and morality and personal experience was sort of separated from the realm of objective truth. This is what is sometimes called in the academic world the fact-value split. All right? Facts, value, split. It was held that the world of rationality and objective facts was the only or the primary reality. But then in reaction to this Enlightenment way of thinking, we had the Romantic movement, which sought to keep alive the value realm and the realm of meaning and morality and freedom and imagination. And it said that's the primary reality. And similarly, we've seen 20th to 21st century, I mean, these are very rough distinctions, but 20th century, society was far more influenced by reason and logic and evidence. Things have shifted in the 21st century back to a place where people are more influenced, again, by feelings and values and emotions. And our society is even being called a post-truth society, and defined as one in which perception is more, an opinion is more shaped or less shaped by appeals to objective facts and more by appeals to emotion and personal belief. And we can see that being played out in our culture today with its concern and passionate discussion around questions of justice and equality and identity and self-expression and authenticity. And even in philosophy, I think we get this split in the academy between the analytic tradition of philosophers who tend to, again, these are broad groupings, but tend to value logic and precision more so than meaningful, deep engagement with the big questions of human life and the human condition, versus the continental tradition, which tends to value deep engagement with the human condition more so than it does strict logic and precision in argument. In other words, since the Enlightenment, this fact-value split has existed, and our culture tends to oscillate between these two realms of facts and values, revering one or the other as primary. But that being said, I think the common uniting foundation still underpinning both realms is this sense of the inconceivability of truth or of meaning or morality outside of one's own reason or experience. In other words, outside of the authority of the sovereign self. But the beauty and attractiveness of Christianity is though it challenges this authority, the idea of the sovereign self, yet in doing so it has the potential to heal this fact-value split or schism at the very heart of our cultural psyche, because Christian faith offers a bringing together of the intellect and the imagination, the body and the soul, and the head and the heart, and facts and values into one holistic and whole reality, underpinned and held together by Jesus, who's both truth with a capital T and good with a capital G. And so you see, while individuals and cultures oscillate between which of the questions is primary, is it true or does it good, is it good or does it work, Christianity regards all these questions as important and answers them with a big yes. And so I think we need to avoid a one-dimensional approach to apologetics if we want to be effective in every generation and in every and to all people in every generation. And so we need to address all three questions, is the thesis. So another way of saying that is that our apologetics needs to be both evidential and existential. So people can differ about terminology, but here's where I land on terminologies about evidential and existential. So most people, when they think of Christian apologetics, they think of it in terms of evidential apologetics. Apologetics that seeks to reach the intellect, using reason and evidence to demonstrate the truth or reasonableness of Christian faith. And this type of apologetics, as you know, it might involve appeals to philosophical arguments for God's existence, the teleological argument, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, and probably one that you're not familiar with, the cosmontological argument. Do you know that one? Does anyone know that one? I thought you were advanced.
No, we suck.
Oh, it's terrible. That's because I just made it up, okay? There's no such thing as a cosmontological argument. I'm just keeping you on your feet. It might involve appeals to evidence and historical evidence for the reliability of the Bible or for the resurrection. But apologetics in the West has been largely evidential. And not surprising, given, as we just said, in the 20th century really lent towards the question, is it true, the realm of rationality and objective facts. But 21st century, I think we really need to address these questions. Is it good and does it work? We need existential apologetics as well. So what is existential apologetics? So here's my definition. All about demonstrating that Christianity is existentially satisfying. And how do we do that? By showing people how Jesus Christ meets humanity's deepest, or answers humanity's deepest questions and meets our deepest needs. So that's the framework I'm going from. And whereas evidential apologetics is about appealing to intellects with argument and evidence to show Christian faith is true, existential is about appealing to people's imaginations with the beauty and relevance of the Christian faith so that they actually want it to be true. And I think this is really important, not only for all the reasons that I've given so far, but also for a very practical reason, which is something to do with who we are as human beings, which is this. If you're like me, and you're much more of a thinker than a feeler, then you will tend to be under the false assumption, as I often am, that all my decisions are purely rational. But it would seem many people from different fields are telling us that even those of us who think of ourselves as truly rational, that our decisions are driven far more by intuition and by feelings than we realize. That we're not just rational animals, as Aristotle asserted, but that we're also emotional animals. The biblical scholar Jonathan Pennington. Has anyone come across Jesus as philosopher? Jonathan Pennington? Yeah, cool book. So that guy, he writes, emotions are the mysterious energy that drives humans to love, kill, marry, divorce, buy things we can't afford, drink too much, and worship invisible deities. And moral psychology backs this up. According to Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind, empirical studies demonstrate that people's political affiliations, moral convictions, and, for us, importantly, religious beliefs, are based more on feelings and intuition than on reason. And he uses the analogy of the rider and the elephant to illustrate. So the illustration, the point of it is that the elephant represents our emotional or instinctive self, and the rider represents our rational or analytic self. And when you look at the rider riding the elephant, who's in charge? The rider or the elephant? It looks like the elephant, but in reality, it looks like the rider, but in reality, the elephant is much bigger and stronger than the rider and can at any time overpower the rider. And the rider, although he may not know this, can't force the elephant to go anywhere the elephant doesn't really want to go. Do you get the point of the illustration? In other words, our decision-making and approaches to life, we think we're just rational because we're quite intelligent, but deep down, it's usually our deep feelings and intuitions that win. Now, interestingly, both the fields of psychology and biology suggest that human reason only functions in decision-making when it's paired with emotion. You need both to make decisions. And there's all sorts of interesting examples about how this plays out. I'll just give you one. There's a case of a man named Elliot who, due to damage to his frontal lobe during surgery to remove a brain tumor, meant that he lost all emotional capacity. But he still retained his reasoning skills and his IQ. So suddenly you've got a guy who's incredibly bright, incredibly high IQ, but has no longer any emotional capacity. Without an emotional capacity, he couldn't assign any value to anything. And without the ability to assign value to anything, he couldn't make decisions, even like trivial decisions, like how to sort his files. And so all this tells us biblical scholars, biologists, psychologists, and medical doctors, they're all telling us that our feelings about things are more decisive than we realize, and that rational argument on its own, in the natural, Holy Spirit, God can do anything, right? In the natural, is unlikely to move people from their deeply entrenched positions, particularly when those positions are wrapped up in emotionally sensitive and value-laden issues of identity, morality, security, significance, or self-worth. Tim Keller says, only if their imagination is captured will most people give a fair hearing to the strong arguments for the truth of Christianity. All right, you can have really strong arguments, he's saying, but unless your imagination is captured, most people won't give a fair hearing to those arguments. He says, let's appeal to heart and imagination as well as to reason as we speak publicly about our faith in Jesus. And similarly, Blaise Pascal make good men wish it were true, make good folk wish it were true, and then show them that it is. I think this is a really good summation of well-rounded apologetics. Make people wish that Christianity were true, existential apologetics, and show them that it is evidential apologetics. It's not either or, it's both and. Existential, evidential, working together. So I want to move on to the practical question of what it looks like in practice. But before I do, 3 quick objections people might have about the role of existential apologetics in evangelism. I just want to address those quickly. First objection people might have is against the idea of trying to make people wish Christianity were true. Trying to make people sounds like you're trying to be manipulative or defensive, so deceptive, trying to convince people of something that isn't true, sort of like a marketing executive or a political spin doctor. But that would be to miss Pascal's point entirely. Of course, Pascal isn't saying that we should make Christianity into something that it's not. Rather, he's saying we should help people see it for what it really is. So the problem isn't that Christianity is bad and we have to make it look good, or that it's ugly and we have to make it look beautiful, or that it's irrelevant and we have to make it look relevant. The problem is Christianity is good. It is beautiful. It is relevant, but people can't see that yet. Why can't they see it? Well, sometimes it's simply because of their own willful blindness. We live in a fallen world. People are fallen and sinful. And sometimes they can't see it because their picture of Christianity is just misinformed. We live in a fallen world. So their picture of Christianity is based entirely on a caricature of Christianity, which actually isn't true. Have you ever experienced this? You're in a conversation with someone and you say, you know what, I don't like the God that you're talking about either. But then the God that you're talking about is not the God of the Bible. The problem is that most people pick up the dominant assumptions of our culture like a dark suit picks up lint without even trying. And that includes false assumptions about God or about the Bible. And therefore, part of the role of existential apologetics is helping to clarify those misconceptions and misunderstandings so people can see Christianity for what it really and truly is. Second objection people might have against Christian apologetics is that by appealing to Christian faith as something which satisfies our existential needs, you're appealing to human desire rather than to duty, and therefore to selfishness rather than to virtue. I think the best way of addressing this, C.S. Lewis explains it really well in his sermon, The Weight of Glory. Basically, the desire for our own good is not a bad thing in and of itself. God often makes appeals to our existential needs to motivate us to follow him. I've got part of the quote by Lewis, but let me read out the whole quote. The New Testament has lots to say about self-denial, but not about self-denial as an end in itself. We are told to deny ourselves and to take up our crosses in order that we may follow Christ. And nearly every description of what we shall ultimately find if we do so contains an appeal to desire. If there lurks in most modern minds the notion that to desire our own good and earnestly to hope for the enjoyment of it is a bad thing, I submit that this notion has crept in from Kant, Immanuel Kant, and the Stoics, and is no part of the Christian faith. Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. And then this lovely image, we are half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us like an infinite child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of water slides at a resort in Poland. We are far too easily pleased. All right, a third possible objection against existential apologetics is just because our existential needs are satisfied by believing in God, that doesn't guarantee that there actually is a God. This is the Freudian objection against belief in God, that it's nothing more than a wish fulfillment. Now, one answer, of course, is to say that, well, if it's an atheist objection, is to say, well, that objection works equally well against atheism, because you could say atheism might be seen as nothing more than the fulfillment of a wish that God doesn't exist, so that I'm free to live my life entirely as I please, without any transcendental interference. But the other answer is simply to point out that the approach that we're taking is not an approach based on existential need alone, but rather on existential need combined with reason and evidence. It's, like I said before, it's existential, evidential working together, making them wish it were true and then showing them that it is. The Christian philosopher Clifford Williams observes, need without reason is blind, but reason without need is sterile. People usually need to see both. They need to see that Christianity is intellectually credible and existentially satisfying. So how? Let's start getting into the how. How do we demonstrate that Christianity is existentially satisfying? There's 2 pages to the notes, by the way, in case you haven't picked it up front and back. Well, in short, we demonstrate that Christianity is existentially satisfying by showing people that it tells a better story. A better story about what? Well, a better story about the things that really matter to us as human beings. Meaning, value, goodness, beauty, truth, hope, love. These are the existential needs or values by which we steer and orient our lives as human beings, either consciously or unconsciously. And to a large extent, we are who we are because of the stories that we tell ourselves about these things. Empirical studies show that human beings try to understand who we are, what life is all about, how we ought to live by locating and positioning ourselves within a framework of narratives. And Christianity has a deep narrative structure. It speaks to the big questions of who we are, what life is all about, and how we ought to live, and not primarily in the form of a series of theological propositions, but primarily in the form of a grand story. A grand story that connects God, Jesus Christ, human beings, and the world around us. And as N.T. Wright observes, the whole point of Christianity is that it offers a story which is the story of the whole world. A story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration that ultimately centers around the good news of Jesus Christ. And it's a story that will bring us to the point of realizing our worth and our unworthiness, our value, which is great, and our fallenness, which is great. And greater than all that, the beauty and wonder of God's restorative goodness and grace in Jesus Christ. Existential apologetics, therefore, is about building bridges from this grand story that ultimately centers around the good news of Jesus to the deepest questions and longings of humanity, and from the deepest questions and longings of humanity to the good news of Jesus. And part of the way that we do that is by inviting people to step into the story. Inviting people to step into the Christian way of seeing things and to ask them to imagine, how does life look from within this Christian story? And then to help them ask, does this story seem to ring true of life and experience? Does it speak to our deepest questions and longings in a more satisfying way? Would we want the world to be the way the Christian story sees it to be? We see this apologetic approach, for example, in N.T. Wright's book, Simply Christian, where he builds a compelling apologetic around our longing for justice, our quest for spirituality, our hunger for relationships, our longing for beauty, and shows us how Christian faith tells a better story in relation to each. I try, not nearly as well as N.T. Wright, to do the same thing in the Sanity of Belief, building an evidential apologetic around our need for meaning and value and truth and goodness and love and hope. These needs, this is no means exhaustive. Clifford Williams, the philosopher I mentioned earlier, suggests we could also add to our list of existential needs. I'm going to say all these ones and then tell me if you think you can think of any others. The need or longing for worship, fullness of life, cosmic security, awe, eternal life, absolution of guilt or forgiveness, even heaven. In other words, there's hardly any limit to the various ways in which we might connect the beauty and goodness and relevance of Christian faith to our deepest questions, concerns, and longings as human beings. We also know that we live in an age in which the Christian story, is it the only story on offer? No. And so part of our apologetic engagement will involve identifying the cultural narratives that inform the mindset of our day. And often these narratives are so deeply embedded in our culture that some people aren't even aware that they have them. The most dominant narrative in C.S. Lewis's day was materialism. And in his sermon, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis writes about how the materialist story might be broken. And his intriguing answer was that in order to break a spell, the spell of materialism, how do you do it? You have to weave a better spell, is what he says. He says, spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have the need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness that has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. So do you see what he's saying? To break the spell of one story, you need the spell of a better story. Alistair McGrath puts it like this. He says, we are called to out-narrate the dominant stories that shape our culture by exposing their weaknesses or showing how they are enfolded by our own or how they are eclipsed by a more luminous and compelling story. We're called to out-narrate the dominant stories that shape our culture. But as Alistair McIntyre says, there's no longer any shared or agreed story. There's no dominant story. There's multiple stories today. I'm going to now read out, so I've summarized from a number of sources: Tim Keller, Charles Taylor, Robert Bellah, Mark Sayers, Paul Williams, Christian Smith. It's all in your notes, these books and the authors. But I'm going to read out a list of today's culture-shaping narratives according to these books. As I read out each one, and the list is on your notes, I want you to put up your hand if this is a big one in your country. Okay, you ready? The material world is all there is, and in science and technology we trust. Yep. Our most pressing need is to save the environment, and we must resist unbridled consumerism in order to do so. Life is a competition to be won. I achieve, therefore I am. He or she who dies with the most toys or trophies wins. Put your hand up higher so we can all see. Yeah, good. Okay, history's making progress and every new era is better than the one before. So get on board with the right side of history. Yeah. The highest good is individual freedom. It's all about you. That's the biggie. Turn your body into a perfect looking body. This is the one I obviously struggle with the most, as you can see. Look inward to find the real you. To feel authentic, I must express my feelings and desires and never suppress them. Yeah, big one. Our ability to make our own moral choices is sacred and must be protected. Yeah. Move toward the perfect life through tips, hacks, and the secrets of success. Yeah. And we talked about this one. Traditions, religions, or institutions that restrict individual freedom, etc., must be reshaped, deconstructed, or destroyed. Yeah. So thank you very much for doing that. As you can see, there's some obvious overlap between these different stories. Some of them are overlap, some of them compete. Now, we don't have to show 100% of the stories are 100% wrong. But what we do want to do is show how Christianity tells a better story. How do we do that? Let me finish up with telling you a framework, and then hopefully time to give you an example, and then hopefully time to have a go at doing it. But I'm madly rushing out of time. But how do we do that? We act. Okay? We act. We A, affirm, C, critique, T, tell a better story. So with every rival narrative, we ask, what can we affirm, what needs critiquing, and how do we tell a better story? And the good news is that this framework of affirming, critiquing, and telling a better story flows naturally from, as N.T. Wright said, that story which is the true story of the whole world. a story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Because creation tells us that everything's originally and intrinsically good, including human beings. And so every human project or narrative or idea is likely going to have some good in it that we can acknowledge as pointing to God's purposes. Secondly, the fall, so critique. We live in a fallen world, so every rival attempt is never going to fully explain, nor fully work, nor fully satisfy. And so part of the way we help people to see that is to critique those aspects of rival stories, show them where they're just not working, where more often than not they lead to disappointment or disillusionment or despair. And the themes of redemption and restoration tell us that we worship a God who, thank goodness, thank God, doesn't leave us to our own mess or expect us to clean ourselves up before he'll help us, but rather comes to our rescue if we'll just own up to our brokenness and ask for the help that he gives. So he redeems. And secondly, he restores. One day he'll restore everything to the way that it should be. So we can tell a better story both for our now, redemption, and for our future, restoration.